Hello, everyone. Ron Gerber here from AngelBeat. Glad to have one of AWS's top solutions architect, Steve Woodard, talk about storage. Now, it's interesting because Steve and I were talking before this webinar, and he was commenting to me how storage is absolutely not monolithic. There are so many different facets to storage that even individuals who currently use AWS for other solutions may not be aware of how AWS offers a whole range of storage solutions across all storage tiers. The other thing that's very relevant is that as organizations want to analyze their data, not just store it cost effectively, which is obviously very compelling, but when you've got object storage, you've got file storage, you've got all these different bits and bytes storing information, you also want a way to analyze that information. So there's another ancillary benefit when you're looking at re-architecting your storage to take advantage of AWS in the cloud. It can also make your line of business colleagues, the individuals who are looking to deploy AI, ML applications and need to access that data. I can pretty much guarantee you it's going to flow a lot smoother if you're taking advantage of platforms like an AWS data lake, where all kinds of different storage files are stored seamlessly, and it gives your line of business colleagues the ability to analyze that seamlessly. So I think this is going to be really useful, even though, as you can see on this title slide, we're talking about cost optimization. And oftentimes, you can not only eliminate CapEx by going to AWS storage in the cloud, oftentimes your OpEx, or your operating expenditure, can be the same, if not less. So with that as a backdrop, I know this is a very relevant topic. Let me turn it over to Steve.
Hey, thanks, Ron. I really appreciate that. And yeah, you're right. I mean, storage is a big conversation. We talk about storage with our customers and really being able to say, you know, I've got all this data. How do I get to a point at which I can really make data-driven decisions? And really, storage is a huge topic. And a lot of those things we talk about are things like AI, ML, analytic capabilities. All of those start to really open up the door for us when we start being able to move into things like S3 data lakes, being able to break down those traditional storage silos from on-prem, and now we can basically move into that direction. But really the focus of today's talk I really want to talk about is really talking about cost optimization and storage. And I have this conversation with a lot of my customers is, all right, I've got an EC2 instance and I'm running this. I've got a database instance and I'm running this, or I'm storing data in S3. My main driver is how can I drive costs down while still being able to have that durability and the resiliency within my environment, and still be able to kind of meet my SLAs to my customers. But how do I drive costs down? So I want to walk you through basically what I put together on a slide deck here, and we talk about a couple of different things with regards to storage. And really kind of the things we want to look at are things like some operational techniques. We'll kind of walk through some of those. I'll even touch on some things that you can look at within your own architecture and how you can drive improvements. And for this talk, I really want to focus on two things. I want to focus on storage within EBS, which is Elastic Block Storage, and then within S3, which is Simple Storage Service. And I want to talk about these two things and how I can further optimize my environment. So we'll talk a little bit more about EBS specifically. We'll talk about EBS first. So EBS, as you think of EBS as a virtual hard drive that you can attach to your EC2 instance or your compute. So EBS is just simply block storage that attaches directly to your EC2 instance. Now, AWS offers various different types of tiers of storage. And depending upon the level of performance for your specific workload, you could choose one, or basically you could choose one over the other. So let's just say, for example, if you have a very high disk, IO intensive application that you're doing a lot of writes in a short period of time, then you would want to select provisioned IOPS. That would probably be the best option for you. If you're storing data files where latency and IO isn't an issue, then you may want to look at lower IO operations like cold or throughput optimized, which are much cheaper. Typically, most customers are fine when they choose a general purpose storage, since it's able to handle up to 16,000 IOPS by default. And then when we get into provisioned IOPS, you start looking at applications that can take up to 64,000 IOPS per second. We're talking about real chatty applications. So depending upon where our workload is, we could choose either provisioned, or we can go with general purpose or throughput optimized, or even cold HHD, depending upon your application performance. When we talk about EBS, some techniques related to EBS include things like deleting unattached EBS volumes. And many customers, they may delete test or old instances, but they fail to delete the volumes, or they say that they'll save it for later, they'll review it, and then they end up forgetting about it years later. What you want to do is you want to select the right storage type for your workload. And there's no need to have provisioned IOPS volume if you have data with infrequent access. So an ideal rule of thumb is to monitor your IOPS usage using things like CloudWatch to determine the best fit for your storage needs, and provisioning only the storage you need. So when we think about it, with elastic volumes, you no longer have to over provision storage, since it can scale the volume as your storage needs grows. So for some instances, that instance types have included ephemeral storage. So things like that, where you can leverage this at no additional cost. But keep in mind that data on ephemeral storage is lost once that instance is stopped or terminated. So you have to basically look at stored temporary data at like cache files. My best rule of thumb that I talk about with customers is, if you're taking an instance and terminating it and you need to keep that data, take an EBS snapshot, store that snapshot in S3, and then delete the EBS volume. You get much lower cost and you still can retain that data. So let's talk about volume optimization. We think about this volume optimization. So for EBS volumes that are already provisioned, or have provisioned IOPS, and you notice that you aren't using more than 16,000 IOPS, you can simply change to GP2, which is at a much lower cost. Also, if you look at GP2 storage, and if you see that you have infrequent workloads to migrate to, you can move that to a lower storage tier as well. Thing to note here is that if you look at it, to note that the lower storage tier is optimized for large streaming or big data workloads, where throughput is better as a better performance indicator than IOPS. It's just another thing to consider here. And how I could get insight into this is look at my Trusted Advisor tool, and Trusted Advisor can make those recommendations for me. And as we talk about a little bit more about EBS, talk about elastic EBS. So a quick note here is on the elasticity of EBS. So once you provision an EBS volume, you can basically implement any of the best practices related to changing the size or type without any downtime. And we just didn't really have that capability on-prem. Now we talk about being able to have true elasticity. This makes it much easier to reduce costs without impacting your workloads. And it's important to note here is that that the volume size cannot be reduced using this method here. So it's another thing here is that if in fact, if you want to change your different storage tier, with a couple of API calls, you can change those EBS volume types to make them GP2, IO, or even in fact, if you want to change that volume type, you can do this on the fly, and you can do this with a couple of API calls. Now I've got my data running in my EBS volume. What next? Most important thing here is being able to take snapshots. And while it's understood that some customers have retention policies that require them to store the snapshots or other backups for a period of time, it's important to check your security policy, such as your retention period and that snapshot frequency, and to make a note, you want to purge the snapshots that you no longer need. And what you can also do is you can also use tagging on the snapshot to identify the purpose of the snapshot, as well as identify an expiration date on when it's safe to delete it. And the great benefit here is that when we talk about snapshots, we say, well, I've got my instance, I have to take a snapshot. Used to in the past, that it used to have to be a manual process. Or what customers did in the past was customers would create a CloudWatch alarm, and they tie it together with Lambda function that would automate the snapshots automatically. But now there's a tool that we recently released, and it's a lot of customers are using it. It's a tool called Lifecycle Manager. And EBS Lifecycle Manager was introduced back in June of 2018. And this is a great way to automatically handle those EBS snapshot management for your volumes. And you can apply the same lifecycle policy to the volumes with particular tags. For example, you may have a different policy to back up development volumes than you would for production. The great thing here is that you can define your schedule with a retention rule, and you can automatically purge snapshots that you don't need. And then you can automatically tag your snapshots using the volume tags or your own. So it gives you great flexibility in being able to automate the ability to take a snapshot, keep the snapshot, and then purge it when you don't need to. So another great thing that you can also do for storage are things like deregister AMIs. So EBS-backed AMIs are basically made up of snapshots of the EBS volume that form the AMI, which will basically, you'll have to basically pay storage fees. So another thing here is to review your AMIs and delete the old ones, or delete basically obsolete ones. Just be careful here. Be careful not to delete old AMIs that have some older running instances that are using, just in case if you need to rebuild that instance or use it in conjunction with an auto scaling group that uses an AMI with a specific launch configuration. But it's just worth noting here to point out that you can deregister AMIs and you no longer have to pay for those old AMIs that you're keeping around. But just in case if you need to use for specific applications, just be very conscious of which ones you're deleting. Okay, so that's EBS storage and AMIs. But I want to talk a little bit more about how I can further reduce costs. So I've got EBS for block storage. I want to look at things like object storage or things like S3. What can I do for things like S3? It's important to note, especially when we're talking about object store, we can talk about different storage classes, and different storage classes will have different use cases. So for things like EBS, S3 offers different tiers based upon how frequently you access that data. So for hot data or frequently accessed workloads, S3 standard is the default option to use. And then of course, as we start getting into warm data, warm or infrequently accessed data, we have S3 infrequent access. And if your workload allows less availability, S3 one zone is available for even further reduced costs. Now, as you start getting into things like cold storage, for cold or rarely access storage, you can use Amazon Glacier, which stores objects at a significantly cheaper rate and gives the option of expedited retrieval or bulk retrieval, basically depending upon how fast you need to have the data. Amazon Glacier Deep Archive is also an option for the cheapest storage costs available. And you can even have it to where you can have the retrieval times occur within a 12-hour period for standard, or you can have it up to 48 hours for bulk retrieval, or you can even do expedited retrieval. So you can move data from the hot tier, move it into the warm tier. As the data ages, you can move this all the way to cold storage. And another thing worth pointing out here is, is that you can do this with a feature called S3 Lifecycle Policy. So you can actually automate how data can move to those different storage tiers in an automated fashion using lifecycle policies. So as my data ages, I can build an automation to move that data to lower frequent or to lower tier storage and help me reduce further costs, further storage costs even further. It's also worth noting that there is also a feature called S3 Intelligent Tiering, where maybe I want to have S3 or basically I want to have AWS kind of already built in some features that I can then start to look at being able to do this in an automated fashion. S3 Intelligent Tiering is a great way that you can use this to be able to provision or basically move the data to the different storage tiers to reduce the storage costs overall. So if we look at things like data lifecycle management, it's very common that the more recently created data is the most frequently accessed. And as that data ages, the data becomes less frequently accessed. So again, back to the lifecycle policy. So a proper lifecycle policy should be put in place to identify what type of data it is, how it should be tagged, and what are the rules on that data when it should be deleted. And these are all things that you should consider in your data lifecycle management policy. So I'll talk a little bit more about S3. So like EBS, you want to choose the best storage class that matches your workload. So place more frequently accessed data in S3 standard and less frequently accessed data in the lower storage classes. And you enable a lifecycle policy to move that data to lower storage based on age, as well as purging the incomplete multi-part upload part. So it's also an important thing to also consider, review the versioning to see if in fact, if it's needed, or configure the lifecycle policy to move older versions that are no longer required. And you can enable automatic intelligent tiering, which continuously reviews your access of objects in S3 and places those objects in the appropriate storage class. And it's worth noting that the intelligent tiering currently supports objects above 128K. So for objects below 128K, if you want to manually review those or look at your S3 access patterns, you can use something like S3 Storage Analytics. And S3 Storage Analytics gives you the ability to review any spikes or anomalous use. And it also basically can be used to determine the appropriate lifecycle policy for your data. And basically this is at about 10 cents per million objects monitored per month. So another great thing is to be able to get insights into S3, and you could use S3 Analytics for that, which is another feature many customers are starting to look at and use. Okay, so S3 is some additional optimizations or some additional things to consider. Couple things are basically regarding S3 are to keep in mind is that you're basically, when it comes to S3, you're looking at being able to keep an eye on those S3 buckets that have sudden spikes in usage. Which can also include unintended verbose logs or applications that miss the cleanup step. It's also worth noting, you want to try to optimize your API calls to S3 by batching operations where possible and reduce those API costs. So another great feature that was introduced at reInvent not too long ago was basically S3 batch that allows you to go through and batch operations, and you can do these between buckets. Really looking at this will help you consider looking at your overall data strategy from a storage perspective when it comes to S3. Going back to EBS, consider things like lifecycle policies and things like that, which can really help drive costs down even further. Again, is that you really want to look at this and you really want to say, you know, are my workloads matched? Is my storage matched to the right storage tier? You may want to consider reaching out to your account manager, talk to your solution architect about making sure that you have got the right storage class. Most of this is already basically published online. It's already published on our public website. So these are things that you can take advantage of. You want to be able to reach out to the experts. You want to ask us a question. I definitely highly encourage you to do so. Really is that when we talk about storage, storage tends to be a topic that we can really spend all day talking about. But really here, I just wanted to highlight a couple of great use cases for things to consider when it talks about cost optimization in the storage, whether it's EBS or S3. I've included a link here for you can go to you know, our site to go take a look at some more cost optimization and some different ways you can manage this. But again, is that storage is a huge conversation. This was just there to kind of whet the appetite. And with that, I'll turn this back over to Ron.
Thanks so much, Steve. Very informative. I encourage everyone, not only in Steve's home base in Florida, but literally around the country or the world, follow up with your AWS account executive. Look at your infrastructure. I would bet that AWS cloud architects have addressed similar storage infrastructures in the past, and to avoid having to reinvent the wheel, take advantage of their expertise. See, you might be able to save money, see how you could balance OpEx versus CapEx, and also see, and we see this a lot at AngelBeat, how to make sure that you tie together your storage platform with your line of business application AI strategies, and that could be another strategic rationale in taking advantage of these AWS platforms. Steve, anything else you want to add?
No, that was great. Again, is that when you start getting into these cloud-based solutions, especially like S3, is that you open up the realm of possibilities. So you start getting into a much bigger picture. What's my data lake strategy like? What's my data warehouse like, solution look like? Really, it starts to open up a huge realm of possibilities as to what you can do now to really get real insights into the data that you already have. So again, I highly encourage you to reach out to your solution architect to work on looking at potential solutions that would be a good fit for you.
One of the things that you can do is by going to angelbeat.com, contact me or follow me and reach out to me via social media, hashtag AngelBeat across Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc., and find out who might be the appropriate cloud solution architect in your city or country or state. The other thing that is very relevant, and this is my concluding comment, is that everyone's jobs are going to change very rapidly post-coronavirus. There's going to be an even greater and faster embrace of cloud computing. It's going to change how your organization builds its IT infrastructure, and it's going to have a big impact on jobs. And the other corollary benefit, when you start rethinking your current storage platform, it's going to force you to work with your line of business executives. And as opposed to your job trying to figure out, well, how much flash storage do I need to buy on-prem to keep everything going and performing correctly? Those kind of more tactical roles will be less and less in demand and less important. But what is going to be increasingly important is individuals who can look at the bigger picture, become more of a strategic storage architect to figure out how do we lay out where we store our bits and bytes to make sure our employer or organization is more cost effective, goes faster in its embrace of digital transformation. That's how you make your employer more successful. And quite honestly, it's going to make you a more higher paid individual who's going to be increasingly in demand. And that's my final thought. Anyhow, I look forward to seeing everyone at a live AngelBeat event, hopefully sometime in the future. Make sure you follow us, again, across social media. Look at our website. We've got a great AWS virtual summit starting tomorrow. We're going to continue to do these virtual summits indefinitely and hopefully can do live events in the near future. Otherwise, please stay safe, and I appreciate everyone's interest. And again, thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye now.